to lose my picture of you.
No.
We screen
We
share.
did it yesterday, remember?
Yeah, we're going to close a few things, and then we're going to share our screen.
Yeah.
I can do this one. And then you can have this one. And you need that one.
Yeah, that's all right.
And then this can be turned off.
Yeah.
And that's it. Okay, you're on.
Right, now I need now to try and share my screen. So I'm going to try that. And I'm going to share this one. So what I want to know now, can you see that?
Yes.
Can you see that?
Yes, we can, yes.
All right, in that case, I am ready when you are ready.
Okay.
Again,
Alan,
you're too close to the microphone there.
Alan, this is John Weeks, and I'm chairing.
Hi, John.
I'm chairing the session, and we have a few quite strict guidelines. The maximum 45-minute presentation. I'll give you warning, I guess I'll have to do it by voice at 5 minutes, and 1 minute, and then it comes to an end. There's no flexibility whatsoever. In that context, there have been 3 presentations. I spent 22 minutes, Jan spent 18 minutes, David Koch spent the full 45. We had a very good discussion. So how long you speak depends on how much you value the feedback that people hear.
I hear you.
All right, so please, again, you have 45 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for everybody, and çok teşekkür ederim to Anne for allowing us to speak to you. We're very sorry we couldn't be with you because our head was very ill and we had to be with him. So with the wonders of Google, we're able to take part in this. The title is slightly different from what is in your program, but actually it deals with the issue of how to judge what role the rate of profit might be playing in the current recession by looking at the way in which that rate of profit, the role of the rate of profit, has been discussed methodologically in the past, and it's proposing that in the future, the way that we study it and the way we study other factors in the recession needs to be modified in the light of a pluralist methodology. And I will attempt to demonstrate that a pluralist methodology is in fact the method of scientific induction, that is, reasoning from the facts. So that's what I'm intending to do. There's a few sources here that may interest you. At the top where it says here, I think this will be in the Dropbox eventually. If you click there, I've uploaded some of the mathematical papers, quite short mathematical arguments, onto my academia site. Sorry, no, they're here. This here is at the end of my slides. There's references, only some, but that's a sort of short list. In my full paper there's more. And here you'll see, I'm not going to click on it because it will go on.
I'm afraid we can't see any of this, Alan. I think you should just begin.
You can't see that?
No.
So can you see the line that says sources and references?
No.
So you can't see it?
No.
Then we have a problem. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Now that's what they're seeing.
So you can't see what we can see under us. We can see a screen share. We can see a slide that says sources and references.
I would suggest that you begin your talk.
But if you can't see the
You
slides,
got it. You got it.
We can.
you can see the slides.
Now we can.
Can you see the slides or can you not see the slides?
Yes. Yes, we can.
You can see the slides. That's good.
Yes.
So I was referring to this one here. Can you see that?
Yes.
Can you see that? Good. Okay. There are a number of mathematical papers which will be found on that site there. So I'm just referring you to the sources that I'm working from. Okay, now I'm going to begin by talking about the aims of this talk. And I'm going to refer to these two graphs to illustrate what I see as the problem. The first one is the components of US GDP before, during, and after the war. That is, during what is generally recognized to be the recovery of the United States economy. The second one is a graph of my calculation of the US profit rate. And I'm going to be very clear that this is my calculation because one concern, the way that it is often discussed, is everybody refers to the profit rate, but in fact there are a variety of ways of calculating the profit rate. So this is how I've calculated its private non-residential fixed capital, and the measure of profit was corporate surplus. And this is replacement cost, not historical cost, so there shouldn't be any disagreement there. Now, when you look at these two graphs, it seems to me fairly evident that the war played a major role in the recovery of the profit rate and in the recovery of the US economy. There's another graph that I haven't shown, which gives GDP, and which demonstrates that in the period, now I don't know if you can see my mouse, but between, let's say, 1942, which is about there, and 1964, GDP, in fact, really up to 1974, the average of GDP was systematically much higher than it has been since. So the war had something to do with the recovery. Now I will be arguing that what constitutes a theory of the profit rate, or anything, the theory of the crisis, is a theory that explains both the rises, both the falls and the rises of the rate of profit, and other variables. And here are the aims of the talk. The basic problem, as I see it, is to assess how we can know what is a cause. Now, if you look at those two graphs, many stories can be told about those. David McNally might say this was a one-time change, historical event never been seen before, and since then we had a decline followed by a recovery. Social structures of accumulation, I hope I'm not misrepresenting David here, but he's there to correct me, would say that this is one phase of a repeated cycle of events in which institutional and economic factors interact with each other. I would say that the war was an exogenous cause that restored the rate of profit after a long period of decline starting around 1918, and that restoration brought about a new phase of expansion, a long boom, which was followed by a prolonged decline. There would then be a discussion about what happened in 1980. Dumiller and Levy would say that neoliberalism successfully restored the growth of capitalism in some sense, and that since then we've had fundamentally a crisis of governance rather than an economic crisis, and therefore that the rate of profit is not a major cause in what's going on. I could go on, but you can see there are many, many different stories that you can tell based on that evidence. And the problem I want to ask is, how do we know which is the cause? Because one way we can do it is we can just tell stories. We can narrate, we can build up readers, we can count the downloads of our papers on blogs and things, and we can say, well, the proof is the number of people who read it, or the forcefulness of our argumentation. I think that if we do that, and this brings me to my second point, restoring induction, we're departing from what I see as the primary method that economics needs to, in my opinion, come back to, which is induction. We need to go to reason from the facts. If we're going to reason from the facts, I think we have to depart from a method which increasingly has become known as monotheoreticism. There are now very substantial circles of students at the last count. The International Student Initiative for Pluralist Economics counted 1,600 members who are calling to the restoration of pluralism in the discussion of economics. And what does it mean? It means that when you're asking how to explain the facts, you consider a variety of explanations without ruling any of them out in advance, and you see which explains best. Now, coming back to my first point, there's basically three types of explanation. One is that there's a discussion about whether there is an internal, so-called, I'll discuss what internal means, an internal mechanism of decline, and is there an internal method of restoration, self-restoration, which is essentially Schumpeter's basic argument, or is it political interference that causes decline, or political interference that causes a restoration of growth or the profit rate, or is it all an unrepeatable historical sequence in which there's no fundamental economic law that it has to be explained, essentially from the outside influences on the economy? How can we distinguish between those? And I'm going to argue that at the centre of the problem, and this is my third point, what is internal and what is external to capitalism? And I think the person who first put this squarely on the table was Schumpeter. And his basic argument is he does what I call endogenizing external variables. He takes variables like creativity, like entrepreneurship, and also, I think, finance. I would argue that he falsely endogenizes that at certain points, and says, well, these are all caused by capitalism. They're all part of capitalism. So obviously, if you take that view, capitalism causes everything. If you endogenize enough variables, then capitalism constitutes the entire solar system, including sunspots, and the explanation for everything is that capitalism makes itself go down, and capitalism makes itself come up again. At the other extreme, there are rare that you have views that are the other extreme. I think you find outside economics on the whole, amongst historians and politicians, but I think institutionalism, especially the old institutionalism, is closest to the contrary view, that essentially it's all a historical sequence, everything is external, there's no law of economic motion. Now I think what we need to do is to reach an agreed method of inquiry, and this is my last point, which will allow us to distinguish with tests that can be carried out on data, maybe new data if we need it, but which are amenable to assessment on the basis of evidence as to what is an expression of crisis, what is a result of crisis, and what is a cause of crisis. That's the aim of this paper. Now, I'm going to start with early history that has recurred. The early history of discussions on the profit rate, and this has resurfaced, I think, in the three-sided discussion between, on the one hand, Michael Heinrich, on the other hand, Mino Carcadi and Michael Roberts, and on the third hand, Andrew Kleiman, myself, and three other authors, in which it appears as if the discussion about the rate of profit is between what I call impossibilism and inevitabilism. Impossibilism is essentially what you get if you apply an equilibrium analysis. And it says that essentially the rate of profit cannot possibly fall. It must rise. It has an alternative, provided certain basic preconditions are met, such as capitalists behave in a cost-saving manner, the real wage doesn't crash, and so on. This is essentially what Mercutio's theorem shows. Marxists spent a very long time, they don't talk about it so much these days, it seems to have gone a bit quiet about Mercutio, but nevertheless, Marxist economists spent a long time arguing that Mercutio had demonstrated that the rate of profit could not possibly fall on the basis of Marx's analysis. Now, since the 1980s, an alternative interpretation of Marx has come along, the temporal single system interpretation, associated with Carcadi, Kleiman, myself, and a number of other authors that I cite in the references, about 30 in all. And if you interpret Marx in a temporal manner, you find that the rate of profit can indeed fall. Now, I stress the word can, because what can come out of a temporal reasoning is the position of Carcadi and Roberts, which I call inevitabilism. And that was also a very early strain in Marxist economics. You find essentially debates around inevitabilism associated with Grossman, to some extent with the more extreme interpretations of Luxemburg, though I think that does a disfavour to Luxemburg, in which it's argued that eventually capitalism must produce a crisis, so some of more theories. This has now resurfaced. And Ben Fine and Lawrence Harris, in an article of 1976, in a fine rhetorical flourish, described that as neo-Ricardianism versus fundamentalism. But I think these views, inevitabilism and impossibilism, are both what I would call fundamentalism. Their origin is essentially French positivism. I stress French positivism, not Austrian positivism. The early 1820s, 1830s positivism of Auguste Comte, who, if anybody responds to the Sorbonne, you'll see his statue there, duly impressed by the pigeons, and Laplace, who argued that a social law is like a natural law. We cannot do anything to stop it. And I think this is fundamentally wrong. So, globalization, extreme version of it, I think we'll talk about that later on. But essentially, any argument that says something is impossible or inevitable is a version of positivism. Lassalle is another version, the iron law of wages, and so on. And the problem is, both of these don't satisfy the test, the inductive test, of a proper test of evidence. They both exclude the alternative by saying the world cannot possibly be otherwise. The impossibilists say the rate of profit cannot possibly fall. The inevitabilists say it must fall. Now, at this point, I just want to stress temporalism, and this is a frequent misunderstanding, is not inevitabilism. From a temporal analysis, and it's not just Marx either, it's post-Keynesian analysis temporal. The early Austrians, and in fact current Austrians, are temporal. The old institutionalists are temporal. In fact, in every branch of theory, whether it's Marxist, Keynesian, institutional, or anything, you find a temporal and an equilibrium, that is a simultaneous version. Temporalism is simply the general form. Equilibrium is a special case. Temporalism doesn't generate an inevitable form. But there are temporalists, particularly Arcady and Roberts, who argue that an inevitable fall is a consequence of their theory. The problem is, this brings me to the third point in this slide, the evidence refutes both hypotheses. Actually, the rate of profit falls, and has fallen for long periods. You may ask how I know that the rate of profit fell in between 1770 and 1875, and the reason is all the economists said it was. If you read Mill's 1848 analysis of the differences between you'll see he says all economists agree that the rate of profit has fallen for a long rate of return on capital has fallen. Right? How, therefore, do we explain it? And the other periods we have better data, in particular the data of Esteban Maito, who produced data profit rate. Can you hear me, by the way? Just checking. Can you hear me?
Yes, at the beginning.
Just check every now and again, if I can't see you, so I don't know. Esteban Maito, an Argentinian economist, has assembled data series going back to about 1850 from a large number of sources covering, I think about 20 or 30 countries. I thoroughly commend his data to you, although not actually his final conclusion, which I have reasons to disagree with. But the evidence, I think, is very well worth considering, and it demonstrates there have been, at different times in different countries, it should be said, but with a degree of synchronization, prolonged 20, 30-year period of decline in the profit rate. That's a fact. It's not something that you can wish away with a theoretical argument, but it's also restored. There was clearly some process of expansion launched in 1848. 1893 launched the expansion which we know as La Belle Époque. 1942, somewhere around the war, not a big deal by the way, launched the post-war boom. So there are moments in history when the rate of profit gets full, and this seems to be associated with the period of economic expansion or boom. So chronology, both of these have to be explained. You have to, in any reasonable theory, including theories which say the rate of profit is irrelevant, you have to explain its rise and you have to explain its fall. There's no inevitable law. Oh, the red point at the bottom, the real question is not whether the rate of profit falls or rises, but what causes it to do so when it does. So let's now just throw up a quick challenge. I just want to demonstrate, and you can go to the website and look at this, that there are two methods of calculating calculating the profit rate or interpreting marks. Look at the graph on the right-hand side, and you will see the temporal calculation yields, and I've chosen this very carefully so that it doesn't just show the profit rate, but that's not a deduction of the temporalism. It first rises and then falls, whereas the simultaneous calculation shows it rising permanently, because if you do calculate value in the simultaneous manner under a dictionary of terms, of course it cannot possibly fall. This is an impossibilist theory. All I wish to draw your attention to is it can fall if you interpret marks in the temporal manner. And I issue you a challenge, which is go to that website, look at the spreadsheet, and if you think you can find a Floyd argument, send it back to me. I would say that for some time now, this has not been done. People have not responded to our arguments. And the third point here is I basically regard that as a theological response. It's equivalent, in my opinion. This is the harshest thing I'm going to say, but it has to be said. If you say it cannot possibly be true, and I'm not even going to look at it, you're behaving, I think, like the pre-Galilean astronomers, like Clavius, who basically said, I'm not going to point my telescope. I'm not going to look at it. A pluralist and inductive argument says, let's consider it. We don't have to agree with it. I'm not asking you to endorse it. Simply, I'm saying people should recognise that it's possible. Just as the simultaneous explanation is possible. Perfectly possible. We should consider all explanations and not rule them out. And that means all theories, bottom point here, all interpretations, and all systems of measurement. Because measurement is theory laden, and therefore we do find that different theory give rise to different sets of measurements. That said, that's probably the harshest thing I have to say. Let's get back to the mainstream of this, and I want to look at Schumpeter's intervention. Now, I hope you can see the red point at the bottom of this quote from Schumpeter. Generally, this is cited to show that Schumpeter approved of Marx and agreed with Marx, and that there's some kind of coincidence between Marx and Schumpeter. Now, I wrote an article in the recent edition, the July edition of the Cambridge Journal of Economics, in which I argued this is not the case, that Schumpeter has been misunderstood, particularly by Samuelson, who sounds like the champion of commentating his understanding of economics. What Schumpeter actually wanted to do was to, how can I put it, nullify or soften the blow of Marx's crisis analysis. So he said, full Marx to Marx, sorry about the pun, because he first saw that crises were a consequence of some kind of periodic movement, in particular the periodic movement of the industrial cycle. But he said, now from that I'm going to deduce something. I'm going to deduce a flaw in Marx. He was wrong about crises. Originally, what he thought were crises was just one of the cyclic process. And I think that that is the main line of most economic theories. Most economic theory, apart from the occasional inevitables, the occasional positives, who like sort of not rhetorical finance, seriously, there's, look, the rich, it does go up, it does go down, many qualities, and the issue is whether it can for itself, or whether there is some external intervention, and whether it declines on its own, or whether it's caused by something external. Now, because we need a long discussion, I'm going to jump somewhere. I'm just going to state my, I'll call it against gravitation. There was a penchant in the 1980s and early 90s to explain the fact that the economy oscillates by referring to the gravitational analogy of Smith, and I was doing that what you've got is oscillation around equilibrium. That actually is Schumpeter's argument. I think this is fundamentally weak and flawed, because the fact that something goes up, it might come down, it might not. The fact that something goes down, it might come up, and it might not, but the reason may not be the same. There are reasons that things get restored, there are reasons that things go into decline. And you can't read into something that the cause of the decline can simply reverse. Also, don't say that sickness cures itself. And I'm worried, especially the longer the crisis gets, with any argument that says, essentially, if the crisis runs its course, capitalism will, by some mechanism, whether it's through the interaction of political factors or through internal economic mechanisms, slaughter of capital values or whatever, it will sort itself out. It might. It's an open question. We don't know. But it might not. So I think the way that we should approach it, political activists, is what can we do to finish this crisis before it finishes us? And since I explained that very much belief that decline is endogenous, but recovery is not, the real question is, what exogenous acts? So, particularly if we don't want to in the way that we got out of the last one, which was international robbery, etc. Now, I'm going to move on to the period where I'm talking about when restorationist theories become dogmatic, but I'm going to move on to an attempt to define thought. I'll briefly talk why I think restorationist theories become dogmatic, but I will just show you the Can you see this endogenous program? Some of you may have heard Goodwin's profit scheme, and Samuelson spoke in a very laudatory way. He has a two-variable, second order differential equation system, essentially wages and employment. He explained that if you have non-linear equations, you have to get self-perpetuating installations, very important. But I produced a model in 1996, which shows actually you can get endogenous self-perpetuating fluctuations with two equations not figure at all. K is capital, I is investment, S is surplus, R is what I call the target rate of profit, A is a parameter, and if you do it, we'll go into example, that generates indefinite self-perpetuating funds without any recourse for the wage. Now here's the fundamental problem. How do we discriminate between profits? They each produce plausible econometric correlations. The problem is you have more than two oscillating variables. Pretty well anything will be plausible. There's a lot of mathematical theory that demonstrates this. You can explain more or less anything once you create variables. Schumpeter, for interest, I actually went and checked it this morning. Schumpeter has 41 variables cycles. What that means is you're then free if you have a cyclic model to make your choice. I think it's so. People believe it's so. This is obvious. My students. It pleases my funding. There are one different reason give claim that a given explanation is true, but there's no inductive test of which is true. Now I think actually this cannot be resolved within the framework of cyclic theory without grappling with something that actually Schumpeter did attempt to do, which is to define force and define it. Because what happens to this, depending on what you think is external and what you think is internal, you get a different explanation of crisis. I find, for example, social structures very plausible. I find some plausible things in Human-Levy's theory and in financialization theory, although I think it's difficult by such theories to explain why the rate of profit in 1980, even on the measures adopted by these theoreticians, has not referred to anything like the first-order rate. But I'm prepared on a pluralist basis to work. The problem is, that's put forward. They say that what governments, the regulatory regime, the structures of accumulation, these are in some sense part of what capitalism is. And they are entitled to do so. But if we don't understand that that's one definition of cause and somebody else might be talking about a different definition. First of all, we're going to have a dialogue there. Secondly, we won't actually look at any test that we can agree on that will allow us to decide what is internal and what is external. Now I'm going to throw a possible definition, not the only definition, because I'm a pluralist, so I'm not going to impose the definition. I'm going to suggest a way of thinking, which is, I think, that what we should begin to think of as internal are those variables which are tied up in a commodity relation. those which you can steal, those which are part of Adam Smith's hidden hand. And that in fact fits Marx's category of commodity, because commodity fetishism makes us fail, disguises as relations to truth. And I think that's how economic rules appear, like physical law. It's the origin of the conflict that I responded to. Now, that goes on, and I think therefore that the profit rate climbs in that way. It's a mechanism to feel that until an exogenous goes away. So during the last recovery, that was war, fascism, the rise of the new contender states, and basically international problem. Something that Ronnie was going to talk about in her presentation, I mentioned, I think very well and at some length in her book. I'm not saying that's what we need, on the contrary, I think it's a better way. That's why the red letters say our job is to work out the better way. The better way I'm in favour of is what I call investing in civilization, which is prioritising human development and the actual side. That's another story. My particular suggestion. And that means that the issue of crisis is reversed. I've written a book, not a book, a chapter of the book by Amir Bachi. We went to a conference in Calcutta, which was a very, very interesting conference. A book which I recommend you all to get, Alternative Explanations of Crisis. And I entitled my chapter, What Causes Boom? And I think the real issue we should be looking at is not what caused the crisis. Because you can't just reverse what happened in a crisis. What we really are talking is a relatively short periods of history. And they are only about 1/3 of the capital, in which you've had these very big expansions. I argue that that's fundamentally the result of the expansion. If we do it that way, this is truly a matter. Because we're saying there's no natural laws, they may be disguised by the commodity relation, but we want to overcome that, we want to take the law into collective for freely made. Okay, now, I'm nearly there. At the very end, I've got a table. And what I've done in this table is I've categorised all the various with in four parts: endogenous decline, exogenous decline, endogenous recovery, exogenous recovery. The reason I'm urging you to look at in my chapter that's around the book, these are the characterizations I'm intending to do. They're tentative. I mention your work in my chapter. I'm trying to make sure I get the best version of what it represents your theory. I haven't really got. Well, I want you to read this with the reference that I have in the chapter to see if I'm misrepresenting. Get back to me that I should be treating you differently, placing you somewhere. Or if you think you're down there. So that's why I'm pointing to do at this point, this is my presentation. Your attention to that. I hope you'll look at this in order to make sure that what appears in the book is the best possible. I'm going to just finish up on one point, which illustrates my point about measurement. I've argued that different interpretations lead to different measurements. My own particular of what is financial taxation is that capitalism has endogenized financial interest. It's taken what was essentially a private, personal relation to wealth, and it has marched. That's allowed the classic mechanism to take a new form. Classic mechanism of practice. Keynes explains it. Yannick has explained it really well, so that's Furia Chick. Marx explains it, is that money accumulates as hoard instead of being found. The twist today is that those money hoards do not take the form of coin, they take the form of financial. And those financial, those credited ones have entered the market. Fictitious capital now compete on a much larger scale. It's always did, but the scale is on a much larger scale as a place you can put your money. So what happened, in my opinion, is since the 1980s, you've had a extended crisis, protracted might be another word, in which financial hoarding has been the form in which money accumulates without being put back into production. And this, of course, ties in with the point much, but very important, that this is fundamentally unproductive. And I think that in that respect, the work that Freeman has done and Greg Mosley has done, chapter, is extremely important, should be paid much more attention because it leads to further. But I've, as it were, gone on a slightly different tack. Those works look at the numerator profit. I try to say, with productive for a share, then they should. If you do that, you get a very different. On the right, you'll see correction for less profit. Incidentally, that downward black curve goes past against an exponential decline of 96%, which I think is from an econometric point of view very good. It also explains another thing. One of the good explanation that we explain all the facts, not just facts of concept. So on the left we have the. I urge you to look at the UK. There is no measure, temporal or any, without finance, on which the UK profit rate has not recovered. And it basically looks as if it recovered from the time of market. I think that's insane. Because if you look at all the measures, unless you can profit rate absolutely nothing for forever, valid theory, a legitimate theory, not valid, but you have that theory. Unless you get that, you've got to explain that rise undisputed but at the same time as massive underemployment, much slower rate of growth, periodic, very deep sense of zero negative growth. I think that is very contradictory to the way. It's actually more important if quarantine in the UK than the US. But if you apply my effect, the rate of profit continues to decline, and you have an explanation for the rate of profit. So I was going to say a little bit about profit squeeze theories. I'm going to say, I think, just one thing, which I have to draw your attention. The third point is, in the 1960s, it became a 1970s, Harrison, and we need to look that high wages were the cause of crisis. If you want to say that, it's a bit problematic. Now, a number of people are saying that low wages are causing many. I'm not saying there's no story, there's a story about saying it's been crisis, it's causing. But then it makes it much harder to develop a theory of crisis because you're only explaining one crisis, you're not explaining both of them. As I say, a valid theory has to explain all the facts, not just the ones that we choose to look at. And so I think that if you want to advance the account that wages were a cause in one case, low wages were a cause in one case, high wages were a cause in another, you need to veer much more towards the idea that the cause of crisis is essentially endogenous, it's historical, was based on endogenous. That's it. I'm going to cancel the screen share. Hope that I've been of some use to you. And I don't, if I cancel that, what do? Can you see me then? Maybe you don't want to see me, I don't know. Anyway, I'm done. That's 14. There we go.
Well, thank you, Alan. I regret to say that for about the last 20 minutes, the connection was quite bad and your voice was fading in and out, so that some of those arguments, at least, are not clear to me. Maybe they are to other people, but given that nothing we can do about that, so we might as well move to the question to David Cox. Let's see if he can hear you or speak.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Alan?
Yes, I can, thank you.
I have the advantage of having read your paper last night, so the warbling speech was not as big a problem as it might have otherwise been. I have a few comments, but I'll just mention two. I'm all in favor of looking at the evidence and trying to explain it. I think that's what we're about. That's what social scientists do. But I'd just like to raise two questions about the approach that you're advocating. One is, has to do with the fact that facts are slippery things in economics. You know, in physics, I mean, the light did definitely bend around Mercury in a certain way when they did the experiment. There was no controversy about it. But in economics, the variables have to be constructed, and there are many different ways to construct them. And things that you cite as facts, almost all of them, there is contention about whether they are facts. You know, did the profit rate, does everyone agree that the profit rate fell after the mid-50s? I don't agree. I think it rose in the mid-60s. So it's a lot harder because first you have to get agreement on the facts, and it makes it harder to do. The second point is I just feel it necessary to correct a statement that you made about the social structure of accumulation theory. No one in the SSA theory community has ever claimed that the recovery from a long-run crisis is endogenous, automatic, the consistent position in Gordon, Edwards, and Reich, segmented work, divided workers, and all the seminal works on the SSA theory is that while every long expansion must inevitably result in a crisis, that the same is not true of the other side, that the recovery depends on the vagaries of class struggle. And in principle, there might never be a recovery, although there's strong reason to expect there will be, but what form it will take depends on how the class struggle works out.
All right, we're taking back brief replies. We aren't building up questions as in a World Bank conference, so comment on David's, then we'll move to the next one.
First of all, on your second point, David, I'm extremely grateful for your show. And thank you. I'd like you to send me the references. I know that if I read your stuff more intensively, I would know what they were. Please do send them. I will read them. And it's very important because I think one of the things that's happened in Marxism is we haven't paid enough attention to understanding each other. And so to the outside world, it appears very much like a sort of, I don't know, a tribe of warring factions. And I think that we do need to correct that by acknowledging the differences that we have in a way that we say we agree to disagree. So that we have to start by actually representing other people, as it were, in the way that they represent themselves. This has always been something I've been keen on in relation to Marx, but it's universal. So I accept your clarification. I will change my paper and my table accordingly. I will incorporate references into my chapter dealing with that. And anybody else who feels that in this sort of, Cook's tour, not quite, this is the dialectical methodology, but this very broad chapter of mine, that is attempting to deal with and incorporate and structure all various possible theories of the rate of profit. If I have misrepresented you, or if I have missed something out, please do tell me, and I will endeavour very hard to correct it. So first of all, thank you for that. As regards tax, this is something on which I have spent a lot of thought, and I agree it's one of the fundamental points. My argument is as follows, and it was the three bold points at the bottom of one of my slides, that when you're testing different alternatives against evidence, you have to consider a plurality of theory, a plurality of interpretations, and a plurality of systems of admission. So when I am testing David Cox's theory against the facts, I will use David Cox's measure of the rate of profit. When I am testing my theory, I will use my measure of the rate of profit. And if I also cannot explain why yours differs from mine, we haven't thoroughly examined the evidence. So I'm saying facts are theory laden, but that does not excuse the facts are primary. Facts are there, whether we understand them aright or not, and therefore we have to test different measures of the facts and include that. And don't get me started on relativity, but actually it's true in physics too. Einstein would say that that light travels in a straight line through space-time. It's only within a Newtonian framework that you say that light bends. So actually the measure that's constructed does depend on the theory, even in physics, but not.
Can we move on to the next
That's
question?
certainly not. We pay issue about this.
Oh, excuse me, I think we moved on to the next question.
has a great deal in common. But now we have more. I more or less didn't find a single word to disagree with.
Wait, can you hear us?
What would interest me is what are the mechanisms.
Can you hear us?
It's very distorted, yeah.
Hello, do you hear me? Alan? Do you hear me?
Well, I can hear you, but not very well. Can you hear me?
Move back a little.
Okay. Alan, this is Ahmed. Hello? Hello? Alan?
I hear you.
Okay.
John, turn off your mic.
And can you please move the camera?
Yes, I can't see on it.
Okay, I'm here. I'm here. Hello.
What was that?
Okay, anyway,
He's here, it's a fact.
okay, my question is very brief, by the way. Okay, since, I haven't read your paper, I'm just wondering, you calculate the capital stock exactly the way Climate calculate.
Right. Are we being recorded?
Yes. Yes.
I think it's better, but I think it's not decisive. For me, for example, you cannot calculate the UK profit rate that way because the numbers are not available. We might hypothesize what you would get if you did it Kleinman's way. My view would be, because sometimes you have to use what I call the barn door principle. If you've got a big enough piece of evidence, it doesn't matter where you shoot, you're going to hit it. The UK rate of profit rises so much from 1980 that the correction of using historic costs instead of reproduction costs could not possibly account for it. That's part of my inductive method. It could not account for it, therefore it's not an explanation. It does help us understand some of the issues concerning the US rate of profit. I believe that the most important factor in understanding what happens in the UK and the US is actually the endogenization of financial securities. That would be my response, which I hope in some way clarifies your question.
Next question, Simon Mom.
Hi, Alan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I have two questions. The first relates to the first part of your talk. I didn't understand why the Apiccio theorem was at all relevant to a discussion of how rates of profit have moved historically. As I understand it, the Apiccio theorem says that with capital using labour-saving technical change and a constant real wage, the rate of profit cannot fall. But historically, the real wage has not been constant. So I don't quite understand why you were talking about the Apiccio theorem as having relevance to a discussion of whether the rate of profit has or has not in fact fallen. So that's the first question. The second question is to ask you to just clarify a little bit why you want to put a measure of financial assets into the denominator of the rate of profit. I guess a traditional Marxist approach would say that you want to look at the rate of profit across the C to C prime parts of the circuit because that's where value expands. Why, therefore, do you want to look at what's going on at the M node of the circuit? Why is that relevant to discussion of the rate of profit?
Okay, I heard those questions. Shall I answer?
Please do. Please do.
On the real wage, the crucial point is that sometimes it has fallen and sometimes it has not. In fact, there is now, as you know, a big discussion in the US, in which climate is a participant, in which there is a discussion of whether the real wage is now falling or rising. Now, actually, I would refer you to a paper that I put up on my ideas site, dealing with Brenner, in, I think, 1998 or something like that, maybe a bit later, called What Makes the US Profit Rate Fall? In that paper, I looked at two possible explanations for the fall of the profit rate. One was the rise in capital stock, the other was the rise in the real wage. What you actually find is, first of all, the rise in capital stock has a much greater explanatory power for the observed trajectory of the profit rate in the US. Second, there is just one period when the real wage becomes a factor, and that's the blip in the profit rate in 1965, which you may remember, and those of you who are familiar with these graphs probably have imprinted in their brain. That blip was a blip caused by a fall in the real wage. That was the offensive, the wage offensive that temporarily restored the profit rate. Then it resumed its decline. So, first of all, empirically, the evidence suggests that the real wage itself is not of sufficient explanatory power for what is observed, at least in the case of the US. I would like to have that analysis repeated for other countries. I'm simply pointing to this one instance. The second reason is a more theoretical reason. In the chapter, I make a quotation from Roma, whose work you may know, Analytical Marxism. And Roma makes a statement, and I'm trying to be charitable to him, because I don't think he fully understood what he was saying. But he basically says that the facts, the empirical facts demonstrate the profit rate is falling, but this has no relevance to the theory. The theory demonstrates that under the conditions you describe, the profit rate must fall. But what I'm arguing is under those same conditions, the profit rate must rise. The profit rate must rise under those conditions with a constant real world inflation. I am saying that's not necessarily so. Now, if you take that view, you have to admit as a possible cause of the fall in the profit rate, Marx's explanation, the rise in the organic capital, the rise in the capital stock. I insist no more than a possible cause. But the problem with the Okishio theory, and I think Marxism is very stuck on this, is although it's now not so open, the mistake this theorem is a true theorem, a mathematical proof that if you do simultaneous valuation, under the conditions given by Okishio, the rate of profit cannot possibly fall for the reasons given by Marx. That is, the organic composition of capital cannot possibly rise. That means that you eliminate as a possible cause the rise in the organic composition of capital. It means that you don't even go to the stage of testing, as I did, whether it might have empirical relevance. Because in your heart and in your theory, you know it can't be true. So my beef with the Okishio theorem, not with Okishio, I've had a lot of discussion with pupils of Okishio, work collaborators with Okishio. I don't think Okishio himself intended that the theory should be taken as having meaning for the rest of history. But I do think that Okishio's theorem means that you eliminate as impossible the cause that you should take into account. Now, as regards financial assets, it's very simple. We're talking about the denominator. Capital can accumulate in the form of money, and it can accumulate in the form of productive capital. If the capitalists all tomorrow put their money under a bed in the form of gold, assuming they can get their hands on it, that would be capital. And it would enter into, if it was on the market, as a possible source of investment, it would enter into their calculations about, shall I buy a financial asset, or shall I invest it productively? We even teach our undergraduates that 101. Uses of capital, which will get you the best return on capital. It's because financial assets are a potential source of investment on which you can get a return that people will make decisions on whether to invest productively by comparing that with what they would get from the productive investment. So my theory is that's an explanation. This is sort of one of the discussions I very much want to have with Jan and Vicky and so on, because I think that the Keynesian account of what's going on is probably much closer to what's going on in many, at least some Marxist discussions, but we need to get to the bottom of what really happens to these financial arguments. And I in particular, I've done some work on the rate of profit in the banking sector, where it's quite clear the banking sector treats money as capital. They may be wrong to do so, but they do. Now, if you're going to treat money in the banking sector as capital, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You have to treat it as capital everywhere. If, therefore, financialisation means that everybody has been accumulating financial assets, including Enron and the economic bodies of myself, because I dealt with their accounts as a computer programmer. If you want to deal with that, you have to look at their financial assets as capital as well. So my argument would be that M is a form of capital, even though it's not in the circuit of capital. I hope that is an adequate response. I must insist, by the way, this is only a hypothesis. All this article on the financial rate, financialisation, profit rate and financialisation, very much a hypothesis. I think it offers a way of looking at the facts which sheds light that we don't yet find. So it's very much an open question as to whether within Marx it's consistent or not. I'm not making a big play that this is the way Marx would definitely have done it. I think that way of arguing sometimes isn't the most fruitful, but I did go back and check, and I think it's coherent with what Marx argued about fictitious capital. That's all I would say.
Other questions? David?
Well, just to follow up on this question of what you count in the denominator, if you put all financial assets into the denominator of the profit rate in the 2000s, you run into the problem that there was a big asset bubble and that there was an explosion of securities whose value was tied to that asset bubble and whose value was expanding rapidly. So you have the paradoxical situation that the fact that enterprises were owning large volumes of financial assets whose values, market values, you have market values in the denominator, were increasing as something that should have made them feel really bad because it lowered their profit rate. I assume the numerator does not include any figure for the capital gains that they were making on these appreciating assets. So it seems like a very problematic measure of the profit rate, particularly in a period of asset bubble and inflating values of financial assets.
I hadn't noticed that they were feeling good. I thought, well, general capitalists were getting very unhappy around about this time. And
In 06 and 07, in 2000? Pardon? In 06 and 07, they got happy in 08. Your data go through 06.
I've had this discussion, that was perhaps a flippant remark, but I've had this discussion with Rick Wolf, were capitalists happy? I'm not sure how much you can get out of asking capitalists how happy they are. What I'm saying is the economy. If you look at the objective measure for performance, the move into financial assets, I think and I hope we can agree, did not enhance the performance of the economy. We don't see it associated with a significant recovery of growth. And by a significant recovery, I don't mean 0.5%. I mean back up to post-war boom levels. It didn't achieve that. So it didn't solve their problems. I think what we're now seeing is it didn't create a problem as bad as we have now. It led to what we have now. It created a situation where the present crisis occurred as a deferred result of what they were doing. So they may have been happy at the time, but by 2008 they became very happy and unhappy indeed. And their unhappiness was provoked by the sins of their past times.
Can I just add?
Radical.
Wow.
John,
I can just make comment.
John, may I add something?
Yes, go ahead. Please do.
Okay, if I may just add something. Just in response to David's question, I mean, I think that the reason to include, the chief reason to include financial investments in the total of investments is that if you look at it from the point of view of the from a subjective point of view of the capitalist, that is how he thinks of it. I have $100, I'm going to invest $30 in a bubblegum factory, which produces real bubblegum, and I'm going to invest $70 in financial assets. For me, the decision is made on the basis of exact, what return I will get from what. When the rate of profit is falling, or I do not see prospects for profitable investment, then I will invest my money in financial assets. That's the first reason. The second reason is that actually, contrary to what we believe about how all capitalists were simply, enjoying increases in return, and that this somehow financial investments restore the profit rate. Actually, if you look at what really happened, there is plenty of evidence of over-competition in finance, leading to a reduction in the rate of profit even there. And then finally, there was one other point I wanted to make, and that is that the reason to include financial assets in the denominator is also, anyway, it slipped my mind, but it may come back to me. Okay.
I just meant some of the issues that you raised, we've been talking about in some detail today, so that might be explain part of the apparent disagreement. But
John, can I just make one?
I'm going to come back. That's very restrained. I think that David's point about if you're going to include the assets, you need to include the capital gains is a quite strong point that any concrete calculation would have to face. Turkish comrade wants to make a comment. Now I'll come back to you, David. Okay.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, me again, Ahmed. So if you add financial assets to your denominator, meaning quote unquote capital stock, I think you're adding additional factor of making your rate of profit excessively cyclical. I mean, we're interested in secular trend of rate of profit, so we adjust my capital stock for capacity utilization. So when you have financial assets as part of your capital stock, quote unquote, so you're not interested, I guess, this capacity utilization adjustment or anything like that, or how do you impose that on that denominator?
The capacity utilization adjustment is precisely one of those measurement issues that I think is very important. In my response today, I said you have to look at every theory in terms of the measure that it itself uses to interrogate facts. So my argument about capacity utilization is I have a theory that doesn't use capacity utilization adjustment. That theory must be examined alongside the theory that does. I will be perfectly prepared to consider explanations that include capacity utilization. In your turn, if we're going to have an inductive process, not a theological process, you cannot rule out that it might be wrong. You have to examine both theories and test both theories in their entirety against the facts. Now, further to that, it's interesting the way this discussion has gone, because I've advanced a hypothesis, no more than a hypothesis. My real argument is about how we define cause. Nobody's referred to it. Nobody discussed this fundamental question, except actually David did, and we came to some agreement on this question of the way that social structures of accumulation envisages exogenous and endogenous causes. But then what we should be discussing is, once we've accepted that, what are the primary endogenous causes that are causing the decline? And above all, for me, the most important is, what are the exogenous causes that cause the boom? And that really is, for me, and for Radhika, the primary question. What are we going to do to get out? My argument is, You only get out if you have a massive state intervention. The question then is, what is the state going to do? Is it going to do what the American state did for the last recovery? And a lot of European countries are beginning to move in the direction of that. Even the IMF, I don't know if you follow the IMF, the IMF has actually now come out in favour of state investment finance by borrowing. An interesting development in dialogue. People are moving in that direction, but I think if you leave them to do it themselves, they will do that in a very destructive way. We'll see the return of some of the worst excesses, perhaps war, probably fascism. That's not what we want. We should be asking what alternative ways that the working class might benefit from, that might solve climate change, that might deal with the liberation and emancipation of humankind, can lead to a prolonged expansion, because having an expansion is really what's required. Social expansion, let's say, is really what's required to deal with the problem of crisis.
If I could just come in here, if I could just come in here for a moment, Alan. We've been discussing exactly those issues all day. So, you know, have to be a little careful about saying causality hasn't been discussed and so on. We've done it sort of ad infinitum. And we talked about different scenarios. David did that. We're even talking about fascism. All of these issues have been under discussion today. But I think that David wants to raise another point.
You made the point I wanted to make.
Okay. And other questions people have? Well, it looks like that we're...
I have one more.
One more, okay.
I just wanted to comment that to say that if a theorist holds that in one period the wage was too high and that caused a crisis, while in a later period the wage was too low and that caused a crisis, this is not an unacceptable theory. That one can have a system which for its stability requires a certain balance, and if it goes out of balance in either direction, there's a crisis. So that is one view of capitalist contradictions, that the wage can either be too low or too high. And either in one case it activates one crisis tendency, and in another case another crisis tendency.
Yes, but that wasn't my point. My point is it's very difficult if you wish to have a restorationist or cyclic. Because if you have a cyclic theory, you have to argue that the cause is the same in each cycle. That was my point. So I'm not saying there is no theory that can't take this into account. And of course, John, I don't know what discussions you've had and what you haven't, and I will read the papers very carefully. But as it were, the point of my paper is to attempt to create a methodology for distinguishing between external and internal causes. That's the real point of the paper. And then the point about finance is an illustration of that. If that's being covered, that's well and good. I would say, however, in that case, it's the first time I've heard this issue covered, and I've been raising this for some 15 years in the literature. People, in my experience, simply use the category of internal cause and use the category of external cause and appropriately felt an essentially dogmatic reason for their particular choice, rather than in a systematic way asking for a criterion that will allow us to agree what we're going to count as internal, what we're going to agree will count as external. And I have suggested that the criterion to use is that of the commodity relation. I have suggested the commodity relation as fundamentally internal, and other, that is, faith and so on, as fundamentally external. That's how I measure the profit ratings. My argument is that this is something that has moved from being an exogenous to becoming endogenous. Naturalization represents the commodification of the relation that was previously partly inside, partly outside the relation, because debts were practically negotiated. So it's very consistent with the argument as a whole. It's not an isolated argument that can be taken out of the context of what I'm trying to argue. But if you've already defined and agreed, worked out methods of defining thermal and internal cause, then that's absolutely fine, and I will be part of that process with great joy.
Well, I hope we haven't been dogmatic today, but who knows, probably there was more barking going on than I realized. Yes, Al?
Hey Alan, this is Al.
Hi, Al.
Just very briefly, sort of this self-promotion, throwing it out. On the narrow question of putting the financial assets in the denominator, I'll just point out, Erdogan and myself did publish a paper on that a couple of years ago, and we did also make the corrections for the capital changes that are associated with that. And we did put some graphs there of what difference it makes to include them or not include them. It was intended as a very preliminary work, not the final word at all, but we were trying to make some considerations how much difference that makes. So if you're sometime, when I get some time, I definitely want to, in the paper we definitely detailed our data sources and methodology that we carried out, so it's very easy to reproduce what we did. And sometime I'm going to want to sit down and compare that to what you did and see what differences it makes and stuff like that. But again, just self-promotion, we did a preliminary pass at that sort of thing.
Al, thanks very much. I mean, I actually remember we were at a session together on the forum about 3 years ago when this discussion began. And at that time I had a great deal of agreement with you, and I was very pleased that you were doing that work. I think that the key empirical task, actually, and in this I particularly invite those of you who have a sort of Keynesian bent to participate, is which financial assets should be counted? Which of them are truly in competition with productive investments? Is it medium term, long term? I don't think, for example, foreign exchange or currency enters that equation in that way. And a lot of the time I spent was actually trying to pour, with the help of Jeff Tiley, through the national statistics from the UK and work out exactly which assets were genuinely marketable. And that for me would be something that collaborative work, which could include non-Marxists, very consistent on this, would be an extremely productive line of inquiry. So thanks for that.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And this brings us in, I wouldn't say for a long day, but a very eventful day that I think will go on in discussion informally after this. Thank you, Alan, and thank you for everybody else who made the presentation.
Cocktails.
Cocktails.
We want to know if we can participate tomorrow.
Yes.
I will try to sort out, so through Skype probably we'll be able to see
that would be lovely.
Yeah, I will let you know.
Nice to be able to participate, at least from sort of your 2 o'clock onwards. I think we would be, because of, we were at our computers by about 6. Then from 2 to 4:30 or 5, whenever you were going, we would be able to participate.
I'm not sure if you will be able to speak, but you will definitely listen. I will try to sort out that too, but I cannot promise.
Okay. All right, but either way, yeah, that would help.
That would be helpful. So we'll sit now. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody. Thanks. Okay.
So, we go somewhere else for cocktails. There you are.
Wait for the word to come down.
The word, yeah.
This is your,
I figured I'll come back another one.
That's an idea. My notes are pretty treacherous.
So the Pope get a favor to buy some of Santo speculating. Well, you could do it. Very interesting thing on the Commonwealth Day was the Labour Party, so 1945 was 100% capital gains tax.
The other alternative.
I think it was only agricultural land. Oh, all in that. Oh,
The other thing you do is anybody who raises higher when they buy it,
Allow all owners of land to declare their own value of their land, which you have the power to purchase their declared value. Grounds for taxation. Why is that? I've been saying this for years.
very close to that in practice. The Cubans, when they repaid, after they nationalized everything, they repaid, they made offers to all countries of the world. Eventually, they're subject to the United States. What they did in the United States, what else? So they actually did exactly that. So that's why the United States turned it down. That's right.
That's your profits, discounted value of your enterprise. It's this, you buy it.
You can declare it. Yeah.